the case that has us all wondering, did Greg Lynn murder Russell Hill and his childhood sweetheart Carol Clay? It's the one thing a jury must decide after a shock twist in the high-profile trial. His fate now lies in the hands of 12 jurors who are poring over 5 weeks of evidence, including the surprise testimony from Lynn himself.
3 people know what really happened in Victoria's remote high country. 2 of them never came home. It's been more than 4 years since Russell Hill and Carol Clay vanished from their campsite. Greg Lynn claims they died in tragic accidents before he covered up their deaths. What the jury must decide is, did he murder them? After evidence from more than 40 witnesses, the defence called just one. On the stand, Lynn proclaimed his innocence. But in the words of Crown Prosecutor Daniel Porchidou,
the accused's story is indeed a series of very unfortunate events. Like the book series of that name, it is also a complete fiction.
Lynn's defence barrister Dermot Dan KC told the jury,
he thought he was going to be blamed for the deaths and he was 100% correct. He was being wrongly blamed and he is being wrongly blamed.
Russell Hill and Carol Clay died at their remote campsite in the Wanangata Valley in March 2020. Lynn told the court Russell took a gun from his Nissan Patrol, which the former Jetstar pilot had left unlocked. The court shown diagrams he drew for police. Lynn told the jury he and Russell struggled over the gun against the bull bar of Russell's Land Cruiser.
The round went through the mirror and hit Carol Clay.
The accused told the court Russell came at him with a knife, which the 74-year-old fell on.
I was panicked.
Lynn admitted he cleaned the horrendous scene using Jetstar-issued gloves and destroyed evidence by burning the campsite. It crossed his mind to make it look like a robbery, and he took cash from Russell's wallet.
I didn't want to be refuelling using a credit card. Having cash was helpful.
Police filmed the campsite days later.
All the doors were closed, the car was locked. Everything in the back of the canopy looks quite orderly.
From that campsite, Lynn drove through the night with 2 bodies in his trailer and left them by a bush track.
I expected them to be found.
The court was told the morning after the deaths, Russell's phone connected in the same location Lynn's Nissan Patrol was captured on traffic cameras. Searchers never found it. Lynn admitted he dumped Russell and Carol's phones in a river. He burnt Russell's drone, keys and the knife.
I wanted to erase all my involvement in what had happened.
He got rid of his trailer and painted his car. He returned to the bodies in a break-in lockdown before he was visited by police and realised his plan to disappear was not working. 8 months after the deaths, Lynn told the jury he spent a night in the bush and burnt the bodies.
I knew, or thought, that once that was over, that I would finally be free of this disaster.
A year later, he removed an awning from his Nissan Patrol after watching an episode of 60 Minutes with his wife, who he lied to.
We believe it's a mid-90s Nissan Patrol. This one is dark blue.
Police had Lynn's car and home under surveillance. 20 months after Russell and Carol vanished, he was arrested. In his police interview, he gave detectives directions to where he burnt the bodies. The jury was told officers later uncovered a ring and a watch there, along with more than 2,000 bone fragments. On the stand, Lynn agreed his actions were despicable.
All I can say to the families is that I am very sorry for your suffering that I caused.
The court told further searches at the alleged murder scene uncovered pieces of skull and a piece of metal described as a fired projectile, and that both were linked to Carol Clay through DNA testing. Carol was a community leader, a former state president of the Country Women's Association. Russell Hill, an experienced bushman who loved the Wanangata Valley. They met as teenagers but later started an affair. The jury told by the prosecution to put that relationship aside and not to accept Lynn's version of events of what happened at the campsite.
On the accused's account over the space of 24 hours, Mr. Hill seemingly goes from cordial to homicidal rage.
The Crown prosecutor told the court Lynn had a year and 8 months to compose and rehearse a script. That the linchpin of his story was the struggle over the gun, but that a rope attached to the bull bar of the Land Cruiser would have got in the way.
Quite simply, the rope ruins the whole account. Once that falls like a house of cards, everything else tumbles with it.
The defence told the jury the guy rope wasn't put to Lynn in his police interview and claimed the fired projectile found 2 years after the deaths had been moved into the area. They were some of the 17 issues Lynn's team raised with the Crown case, claiming the prosecution engaged in
a series of increasingly desperate and ill-fated tactical manoeuvres.
For the first time, Lynn's wife and son were in full view of the jury, holding on to one another. As Lynn's barrister claimed he'd got through his cross-examination unscathed.
All of the things that needed to be put to him that were going to form part of the address, they weren't by the prosecutor, because they weren't getting anywhere.
The prosecution alleged Russell was killed first at the remote campsite, but they can't say how. The Crown told the jury Lynn was calculated in a series of actions he took, the most extreme, burning the bodies.
To obliterate any possibility that there could be forensic evidence, the only reasonable explanation was that he knew he had murdered them.
The defence told the jury there's no case to answer on either murder charge, that the allegation Carol may have been eliminated because she witnessed Russell's murder was just a theory.
There's on the prosecution case zero factual foundation, zero motive. You just can't say, well, look, we don't have any evidence, but just convict him anyway.
And joining me now is Penelope Liu. She's outside the Supreme Court in Melbourne. Penny, it is such a tragic but intriguing case, and the jury has now adjourned. How long do you think it will be until we get a verdict?
Well, Deb, the jury today essentially went out into a weekend. The first full day of deliberations for them will be on Monday. This week they've heard the prosecution and defence closings, as well as the charge from the judge, Justice Michael Croucher. That's where he sums up the case. He's given them directions on matters of law and made it clear that they must decide on the evidence, that they must be the judges of the facts, and that they must reach unanimous verdicts, where 12 of the 12 jurors who were charged with deciding this case come to that same decision of either guilty or not guilty of the 2 charges of murder. And now, while this was all happening, as it has throughout the trial, Gregory Lynn today was sitting in the dock inside the Supreme Court in his suit and tie, watching as the judge addressed the jury for the last time before they left to begin these deliberations.
And the jury's also been told that they can't find Greg Lynn guilty of the lesser charge of manslaughter. Why?
Well, this was another element that was put to the jury during the judge's charge, Deb. When they first sat down, when they were first selected over 5 weeks ago, it was put to them that they may be considering at the end of the trial an alternate charge of manslaughter. Greg Lynn has only ever been charged with 2 counts of murder, but the judge explained that in cases where you can't find a person guilty beyond reasonable doubt of murder, the jury then may be able to consider that manslaughter charge. But those 5 weeks on, he's told the jury that after consideration and agreement from both parties, it had been decided that in this case, in these circumstances, if the jury couldn't reach that guilty verdict beyond reasonable doubt for a charge of murder, that they couldn't reach that for manslaughter either. So it's now murder or nothing, and they must decide individually on those 2 individual charges of murder.
And what is it about this case that so captivated the nation?
Well, Deb, it was 20 months that Russell Hill and Carol Clay were missing. They seemed to just vanish from this burnt campsite. It was that year and 8 months later that the public heard Greg Lynn had been arrested. We now know he led police to their remains that he had burnt after talking to them in that police interview. But at its heart, there are 2 families whose loved ones didn't come home. And For them, this can only be, like it is for Gregory Lynn and his family and his defence side, an incredibly difficult time as they try to deal with the stress of waiting for a verdict, but ultimately it will come down to what the jury decides, and they have been told they must decide with their heads, not their hearts, only on the evidence that has been given in this case.
All right, Penelope, thank you. Penny Lersch there.